Welcome back to Uncensored.
Great to see you, Piers.
I've one question for you. I've been waiting to ask this all of this year so far, all 2 weeks of it. What the hell is going on?
Well, you kind of teased it by saying that the United States is rejecting its own previous rules-based order. Not that it was always consistently following it, but it was much more reliable in the eyes of its allies in promoting free trade, which it's not particularly committed to anymore, in promoting U.S.-led collective security, which it is now focused much more transactionally on, and in promoting rule of law, democracy, and foreign aid, which it's less committed to. And all of those things at a time when the United States is much more powerful than its allies. It's the most powerful country in the world, though I would argue Trump is not the most powerful leader because of the checks and balances on him compared to, say, Xi Jinping in China. Different story, but that's the big thing that I think is going on.
You had a very interesting statement from the Eurasia Group at the start of the year. 2026 is a tipping point year. It's a time of great geopolitical uncertainty. The United States itself is unwinding its own global order. The world's most powerful country is in the throes of a political revolution. And that is certainly how a lot of people see it. I mean, look, I would say, I remember 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq, a sovereign democratic country, on what turned out to be completely bogus pretext of Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. I campaigned against it as editor of the Daily Mirror here in this country, and sadly was unsuccessful in stopping it. But you know, that was, you could say that what America and the UK and its allies did with Iraq that year was a throwing up of the rules-based order. It was an illegal invasion of a sovereign democratic country. My point being, you know, is it really so different? I mean, this time, Trump goes into Venezuela in the dark of night in a brilliantly skilled military operation with no casualties on the American side and snatches a very divisive, corrupt leader who probably is a drug-running gangster who certainly has defied the democratic rule of his country by refusing to leave office when he lost the election and so on. You know, and he would say with Iran, you've got a vile regime that frankly needs toppling, and the people clearly want it toppled. That's why they're hitting the streets in such big numbers. And he constructs an argument for Greenland, which is that, you know, this makes absolute military, strategic, economic, and every other sense you could possibly wish to have. And if the Greenlanders do a deal with us, then what's the problem? In other words, is part of the thing here Trump's rhetoric more than the actual actions that he's doing that makes you think the world order's being thrown up?
Sure. Part of it is Trump's rhetoric. I mean, just this morning, I had a little back and forth with, I think it was David Frum on Twitter X, because he was saying that, you know, the United States is getting ready to assault Danish soldiers, which is absolutely not the case. It is American unilateralism. It is utterly unnecessary for American security. So I don't think that I think the argument is spurious and it weakens NATO, but it's not like an invasion is being planned. So I think that there are a lot of people that look at every single thing that Trump does and assume because it's Trump, it's a disaster. And a lot of what Trump has already done has been successful. Certainly the military operation in Venezuela, you and I would describe as successful. Certainly the first phase in Gaza, you and I would describe as successful, supported by the Security Council of the United Nations. And many senior cabinet members of the Biden administration have begrudgingly, at least privately, said that Trump has accomplished more on Israel-Palestine than Biden was able to. So it's not about that. But again, I want to talk about the structure. The structure
Before
is
we get into this video, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more videos. In this powerful moment from Piers Morgan's show, the conversation turns to Donald Trump's bold warning, F around and find out. Trump's message is simple but strong. When a nation pushes limits, consequences follow. From Greenland's strategic value to rising tensions with Iran and the political crisis in Venezuela, this discussion highlights how power, influence, and leadership shape global decisions. Whether you agree or disagree, one thing is clear. This moment on Piers Morgan's platform has sparked serious debate worldwide. Watch closely and decide for yourself.
The United States was actively promoting global free trade architecture. It is now using tariffs as the principal tool of weaponizing U.S. economic power globally, and American tariffs are higher than they've been at any point in almost 100 years. So that's very different. The Donroe Doctrine, where the Americans, yes, not regime change in Venezuela, but going in unilaterally, not talking or coordinating with allies beforehand, planning similar things, perhaps in Nicaragua, in Cuba, maybe individual military strikes even against drug cartels in Colombia and Mexico, and potentially willing to risk NATO in order to make a unilateral deal, not with the Danes, who are an ally that supported the U.S. after 9/11 in Afghanistan, but with Greenland. All of that is new. And all of that comes at a time where Trump is the most revolutionary domestic president, certainly since FDR. And I would argue, actually, including FDR, trying to really control the administrative state and reduce or remove the checks and balances on the U.S. executive for reasons that he finds very compelling, that his supporters find very compelling, but doesn't make him any less revolutionary. So, yes, I do, Piers, think that this time is indeed different.
Stephen Miller, who is a very key figure at the White House, obviously, after the Venezuelan operation, was interviewed by Jake Tapper on CNN, where he suggested the United States was now pursuing a policy based on might and power. Let's take a look at this.
We live in a world in which you can talk all you want about international niceties and everything else, but we live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world that have existed since the beginning of time.
What did you make of that?
Well, it's cute in the sense that it's obviously true. The United States is the most powerful country in the world, and so therefore it has been able to set rules as it sees fit. Now, over the last 75 years, it used its dominant power position to set up alliances that it believed was advantageous, not just for its allies, but for the U.S. Collective security with NATO, for example. It's used its power to extend free trade agreements with countries all over the world, its allies and even its adversaries like China. And the United States believed that using its power to make it seem reliable to allies over time ultimately created a stronger coalition that put countries like China more in the corner, that forced them to do more of what the United States wants. Now, when you get rid of that, there's certainly true, Piers, that there's a big difference between taco countries and FAFO countries. Trump always chickens out and F around and find out. And Maduro thought he was more powerful than he was. He called Trump's bluff, and he's now sitting in prison in New York. He FAFO'd, right? He doesn't have any influence. China has been taco. They've been able to force the Americans to back down, not only on tariffs, but now exporting chips and backing down on drone restrictions just a couple days ago. And Trump can't wait to meet with Xi Jinping in Beijing in April. And he talks about a G2. I mean, that is absolutely true. Stephen Miller has a point that President Trump can't actually do much with the Chinese because they're so powerful. The U.S. just announced 25% tariffs on everyone that does business with Iran. I assure you that the Chinese will not be included in those tariffs because the Chinese are much more powerful. So Miller has a point that the Americans don't have much leverage with China. But the way that the United States is deploying its dominant position is very different today than it was a year ago or in the first Trump administration. And that's where the fact that Miller doesn't mention that, I think, is convenient. It's convenient.
Donald Trump, when he won in 2024, I rang him that morning, the morning after he won. And we had a reasonably short but very interesting and very telling conversation, I think, because he said that the one thing he'd spent 4 years out of office ruminating about what he could have done differently, what he could have done better. And he said, we're really prepared this time, in terms of the personnel he was going to use, the stuff he was going to do quickly, the use of executive orders, all that kind of thing, all the stuff that's come out. I think Trump has planned all this in his head for 4 years with his team. I don't think this is as scattergun as people think. What's interesting is in 2009, you coined a phrase G0 world, where you predicted a world without global leadership, where no country or group of countries would be willing or able to lead the world. And if true, it would mean a breakdown of the post-World War II world order based on international laws that came out of Nuremberg, the UN, NATO, and instead returning to a world where great powers got to do and get to do what they want. Is this a very dangerous moment? If what we're seeing is Russia acting with impunity, the United States now acting with impunity because they believe the world order is no longer fit for purpose, and then, for argument's sake, hypothetically, China looks at all this, sees maybe the United States take Greenland and says, OK, we're taking Taiwan. You've lost your high moral ground. What are you going to say? We shouldn't be allowed to do this, even though we want to do it for security reasons or whatever. So it seems to me, in a way, what you were predicting has kind of come to fruition, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, yeah, the fact that I wrote about that, and the name of the book was called Every Nation for Itself, right? And that clearly defines kind of the way that the world seems now to America's friends and adversaries. Didn't mean I was rooting for it. I just thought it was overdetermined.
Yeah.
It was in part because the Russians weren't integrated into the West. The NATO-Russia Council, the G7+1 were fig leaves, but there was never any intention to try to bring Russia into the West. The Chinese were integrated into the global economy on the assumption that as they got wealthier and more powerful, they would become more politically and economic like us. They'd reform politically, more democratic. They would reform economically, more supportive of free markets. The latter didn't happen at all. Xi Jinping consolidated power. It's still very much a dictatorship. And it's, if anything, it's more of a state capitalist country. And then the most important is the United States said, okay, we're not interested in supporting all of the rules that we supported historically. We're much more powerful than our allies. We don't think we're getting much out of it. A lot of Americans felt like they certainly lost from the hollowing out of the country from both free trade in terms of labor, from the wars that they fought in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam that they didn't get anything out of, and from open borders and immigration. So those are the three reasons why, for me, a G0 world felt overdetermined. But where I'll push back is the idea that this suddenly is going to change Russian and Chinese behavior. So, I mean, the Russians, it's not like the Russians have been restrained because the Americans had the high moral ground. The Russians are just incapable, right? If the Russians could have pulled off, a tenth of what the U.S. did in Venezuela, Zelensky would be in jail or dead. And you and I would be having a very different conversation about the future of Europe. But because Russia is so incompetent, because they're so kleptocratic and corrupt, because their military is so inadequate for what Putin thought they could do in a week or two, they're still fighting, a centimeter at a time on the ground in southeast Ukraine, having, had a million casualties, Russian casualties in that meat grinder. China is certainly playing the long game, and they're much more capable. And I'm much more worried that what the U.S. right now is giving away the store in 5 and 10 years to the Chinese. But in the near term, they're not restrained on invading Taiwan because the United States didn't have the Donroe Doctrine. They're restrained because Taiwan is an incredibly well-fortified island with a lot of military support from the U.S., with utterly critical economic and technological capabilities that go to China, and the Chinese are smart enough not to take such a risk. So I do think that there is a level of rationality on the part of the Chinese and a level of lack of capacity on the part of the Russians that make this a little bit more stable than you might otherwise think. One other final point here in response to your question is there are a lot of countries around the world that don't like the vulnerability they presently have to U.S. unilateralism. So you've probably just seen that the EU-Mercosur trade deal, after many, many years of fruitless negotiations, has just been agreed to between the Europeans and all the major South American economies. That wouldn't have gotten done without Trump. And it's because of the U.S. ripping up a lot of free trade agreements and putting on tariffs that the Europeans and the South Americans said we need to increase our trade as a hedge against all of our, basically dependence on the U.S. market. The Indians are trying to do the same with the EU and with Australia and with others. And I see that kind of action happening technologically, economically, even militarily. As the Europeans spend more on their military capabilities, they're also becoming more interdependent over the medium to long term for their own critical enablers, and they're going to buy less from U.S. defense companies. So I do think the Americans have to worry that they're making some decisions that are going to lead to a lot of headline wins in the next months or year or two, but that long term will actually undermine America's position in the world.
I had a big animated debate with my team, which we often do in the meeting before the shows we're doing today. And it was about what would happen if Putin or somebody else invaded a NATO country. Would the United States automatically, under Article 5, come to the help and defense of that NATO country? And I was emphatic that I absolutely believe they would. That nothing that Donald Trump has said about any of this has made me think, in that eventuality, the United States would not stand full square behind a NATO country. I think it all goes back to when he used that phrase about NATO becoming obsolete, which he meant, and I knew what he meant at the time, and I clarified it with him in an interview. Yeah. He meant that the structure would become obsolete if NATO countries simply carried on refusing to pay their dues. Most of them, I believe, almost all of them now, pay their dues. And he hasn't used that word obsolete about NATO since then. In fact, I think he's been a very effective tool in making NATO more collectively responsible in terms of paying their money up. But I'm interested in what you think. A lot of my team do not share my confidence that would happen, and that this move towards unilateralism may put into question the United States actually coming to the rescue of a NATO country. What do you think?
First of all, it's a great question, Piers. I'm really glad you asked it. I think that you are absolutely right that it is because of Trump that the Europeans are spending a lot more money on defense. It's also because of Putin, of course, but Trump has been pushing, and he wasn't just pushing in the last year, he was pushing in his first term too. And I think that matters. So you can argue that NATO is stronger from a total defense spend perspective, and Trump deserves some credit for that. That's number one. Number two, whether or not the United States would come to allies' aid is in part a matter of perception. And many frontline European states perceive that the United States is no longer as reliable and that they are much more vulnerable, and they're not convinced that Trump would come to their aid, particularly when Trump says, he doesn't say they're obsolete, but he does say, well, if it's a choice between Greenland and NATO, then, maybe I'm going to have to walk away from NATO. If the Nordic states and Macron just today and others are saying that, you take Greenland, that's it for NATO.
Before we get into this video, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more videos. In this powerful moment from Piers Morgan's show, the conversation turns to Donald Trump's bold warning, F around and find out. Trump's message is simple but strong. When a nation pushes limits, consequences follow. From Greenland's strategic value to rising tensions with Iran and the political crisis in Venezuela, this discussion highlights how power, influence, and leadership shape global decisions. Whether you agree or disagree, one thing is clear. This moment on Piers Morgan's platform has sparked serious debate worldwide. Watch closely and decide for yourself.